Hello, Free Radicals listeners. Thanks for following along. Today's episode is an interview with Professor Geoffrey Dipple. He is a professor of history at the University of Alberta. He focuses most of his work on German-speaking territories at the time of the Protestant Reformation. He has written and contributed to a long list of books, including one, a collection of essays fresh off the printers at Pandora Press in Kitchener. That book is called Anabaptism, Radicalism, and the Reformation. He is also part of the team putting together a new book on this Münster story, and it is called The New Jerusalem, Documents Illustrative of Anabaptist Münster. He is also speaking at the upcoming gathering of the 16th Century Society in Toronto at the end of the month. He will be part of a panel discussing the 500th anniversary of Anabaptism, and he will also make a presentation about the community of goods in Münster, which is what we're talking about in today's interview. I haven't focused too much on the economic part of this story, but one of the radical things the Anabaptists in Münster did was to implement community of goods, meaning that all of the wealth in the city was redistributed, at least in theory. The biblical precedent for this comes from the book of Acts, chapters 2 and 4. Acts chapter 2, 44 to 45 says, "All the believers were united and shared everything. They would sell pieces of property and possessions and distribute the proceeds to everyone who needed them." Most Christians I know talk about this phase of the early church as the pinnacle of how Christian groups should function. I've met lots of contemporary Christians in various countries even who want to live in community with other believers. But it's much less common to find someone who's willing to own in community or to not own, as it may be. Except the Hutterites that I meet at the local farmers market, we don't really see this kind of collective goods living. As Professor Dipple says, there's a spectrum of thought on this. Some people say that community of goods was implemented in Münster out of a faithful adherence to Scripture, while others say that it was a way for leaders to control wealth in the city. I'm curious what you, the listeners, think it was. I hope that you enjoy our conversation, and I think Geoff has a lot of interesting things to say about the community of goods in Münster. Okay. All right. Well, welcome to the podcast, Geoff.
Thank you.
So we are going to be talking today about the community of goods as experienced in Münster in the in the 16th century. Can you give us a bit of an introduction to what that looked like? What was confiscated? What was shared?
Okay, there really are essentially two phases in the establishment of community of goods in Münster. Shortly after Jan Mathis really begins to assert his authority as prophet, there's a general establishment. So in March 1534, there's essentially a confiscation of the goods of people who emigrated from the city, and then essentially a redistribution of at least the movable property. From those emigres to, you've got a significant number of immigrants, Dutch Anabaptists who've come to Münster. Suggestion is basically, in terms of numbers, a roughly equal exchange of population, right? So Catholics, those inclined to a more Lutheran reform who flee the city, Anabaptists then from the Netherlands who come in. These sorts of things are complicated a bit by the fact that you've got people staying to ensure that they can protect their property. In many cases, women, right, who stay behind because of the nature of legal responsibility, those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
That's the big one. And then in May and June, after Mathis dies, in his sort of what's been described as a suicidal sortie, gets at Easter, right, when he says Christ is going to appear and Christ doesn't appear, and so he goes out. After that, you've got a couple more instances. You've got one case where they begin collecting more goods, lay down sort of specific types of clothing people should wear and confiscate the rest, that sort of stuff. And then in June, with the establishment of polygamy, there's also there's some discussion the seizure of more goods. So these are the two. The later ones are more extreme, and by this point, the siege is getting more and more effective, right? So
Yeah.
resources are dwindling and these sorts of
Okay.
things. It's a step process for sure.
Okay. So can you speak to some of the motivations of making this happen? There are biblical precedents. It sounds like from the story that there are pragmatic reasons in terms of providing for people. So how do you see it as a historian? What are the justifications of this?
Yeah, this one's a complicated one, and it's, I think, still fairly highly contested. Although I think the person who's probably made the most authoritative statement here is Jim Steyer in the book German Peasants' War and Anabaptist Community of Goods, where he really emphasizes the pragmatic nature. If you know, I've been going through this because of my own interests in this topic. So if we look at sort of the official statements about community of goods and sort of juxtapose them on the activities, we get like again sort of a step process. The earliest statement about community of goods in relation to Münster appears in a publication entitled The Confession of Two Sacraments from the end of the summer, beginning of the fall of 1533. So this is before Anabaptist control of the city
Right.
council. Certainly Bernhard Rothman is involved in it, possibly the other Wassenberg preachers. And the statement there is harkens back to descriptions in Acts 2 and Acts 4 about the apostolic community sharing their goods. And it's used very much to emphasize sort of the communal nature of the Lord's Supper, right? So it doesn't really seem to be an agenda in and of itself. So that's the first statement we've got, and completely divorced from any activity. In March, under the leadership of Jan Mathis, when the first round of Community of Goods is instituted, if we can believe the reports, Rothman himself gives a sermon in which he justifies Community of Goods in exactly these terms.
Mm.
Right, so we've got this continuity between the two. Does he just reach back to what he'd said earlier, or is this a clearly thought out sort of ideological position? So I'd say this early one is kind of difficult to suss out in some ways, right? You've
Right.
got a spread of time with a lot of things happening. The later ones after Mathis's death, the two sort of instances I mentioned earlier there. This is after Jan of Leiden institutes the government of the 12 elders modeled on ancient Israel, right, on the
Right.
tribes of ancient Israel. Then at that point, the suggestion is that there's still reference to apostolic practice, but now there's talk of the new Israelites. So it seems to
Mm.
be tied into, the sort of more apocalyptic context, but also sort of, they've established a government system based on the 12 elders. Now they're referring to the people as the new Israelites. And then the final statement we've got is from the fall of 1534, Bernhard Rothman's restitution of true Christian doctrine, faith, and life, where there's a slightly more detailed account of ending exploitation, people exploiting each other and stuff. I would say in the latter two cases, very much we have justifications following activity, right?
Mm. Okay. Yeah.
The first one's a tough one, and Jim's book talks about how Acts 2 and 4 are such a driving force for
Yeah.
so many movements, particularly for
Mhm.
Anabaptists. So I would say so we've got some sort of transition there. I'm not really sure how dramatic.
Yeah. Yeah, and the apocalyptic tone changes after Mathis's death, right? Because if the world is ending, wealth is meaningless.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, okay, we're going to stick around for a little while, then we need to implement something practical.
Yeah,
Now,
and I think in that context, right, if you're preparing for the return of Christ, then exploitation should end and these sorts of
right,
things.
yeah. Yeah. So one of the criticisms within the sort of the more traditional, maybe propagandistic version of the story is that Jan van Leyden himself was excluded from this expectation of shared belongings, that he lived lavishly, that his wives lived lavishly, while peasants starved. Do you believe this was the case, or are there other people who were spared the expectations?
Yeah, there's charges of essentially hypocrisy in this case, right? The leadership is living well, everybody else is starving.
Yeah.
These run through the sources that we have, with the exception of sort of the confessions that the leadership gave after they were captured after the fall of the city, who said, no, we didn't have anything special. Everybody else seems to. Now, most of the other sources come, or most of the other accounts come from hostile sources. So we've got to
Right.
weigh those against each other. I'm inclined to accept the notion that there was an elite group who were living well. A lot of so this would be Mathis or Jan of Leyden and his wives, but also sort of his royal council.
Hmm.
He had a royal court he established with some leading figures there. And a lot of the recent research that I've read suggests that these people are, that there's a very careful balance between sort of prominent people who came from outside the city and prominent people from inside. So this is a much more political sort of situation than we originally
Hmm.
thought it was. And my gut reaction just on reading the accounts and reading the scholarship about it is that there was this elite group who continued to live much better than the run of the mill person, anybody than the commoners.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and there was something I forget where I read it, but sort of talking about the 16 wives. Many of them were linked to some of these well-established families,
Yeah.
partly as a way of legitimizing the kingship and the leadership structure to hold on to some of those people who already had power.
Yeah,
So
and
that,
I think sorry, and some of what I've read, a real emphasis on this balance of power between people from outside the city and native Munsterites.
right. Yeah, so then there was sort of maybe it doesn't show up in too much of the writing, but the balance of power wasn't entirely based on charisma and apocalyptic speaking. Some of it was
Yeah.
rooted in historical legacies.
Yeah, in that sense, Steyer talks about, essentially suggests that after Jan Mathis's death, what you've got is basically an attempt to institutionalize charisma. That Jan of Leyden is much more rational than Jan Mathis
Hmm.
if you listen to some of the accounts of the things
Yeah,
that he's alleged to have done, and more calculating and stuff. And yeah, this is we're gonna shore things up as best we can and keep going with this.
right. Yeah. Um, one of the things that I was wondering about with this story, uh, people talk about the violence, within the kingdom, and then the blowback from the Catholic authorities. People talk about the sexuality, the legalizing of polygamy. There are so many salacious parts of this story, even maybe lurid details. Um, so why would historians, for the past 500 years, focus on this financial part when it seems like there's so many more interesting parts of the story?
Yeah, this is actually sort of what I've been working on most recently. So I've got a few answers. They're somewhat speculative at this point, but I think I've got some evidence to back them up. The thing that strikes me is that when you read the actual accounts, the discussion of the institution of community of goods and and its implementation doesn't seem nearly as prominent as it does in later historical reconstructions of
Hmm.
the events. If you look at the accounts of Henry Gresbeck and Hermann von Kersenbrock, um, they highlight community of goods in important ways, but they don't spend a lot of time, at least on the concept of community of goods. It's described fairly quickly, especially in like Kersenbach's account is hundreds and hundreds of pages, right? And
Yeah.
community of goods is quite minor. And the other thing about these accounts is that they're not very concerned with the idea of community of goods. It's what sort of happens when it's implemented, and what goes wrong with it, and these sorts of things. So they're less concerned with the account, with the concept itself, much more with problems with it. That seems to change with modern historians, and my suspicion here is that that Marxist historians picked up on this. This is a classic moment for them in the theory of the early bourgeois revolution, right? This is the proletariat rising up, grabbing power, doing away with private property, everything that Marx had predicted. And so it gets that emphasis in Marxist historiography. Not surprisingly, in the context of the Cold War, Western historians jump on this and say, yeah, that's right. And that's why we know that they were religious fanatics and they were all crazy and these sorts of things, right? So I think, to my mind, this seems to suggest that, in some ways, this is something that's gotten elevated, probably in the 19th and the 20th centuries.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So then for the Marxist historians, they would have seen religion as sort of an incidental component to this inevitable clash of wealth, or how did the Marxists see the religious component?
Yeah, they would have said that, well, this is the way people voice economic concerns in a pre-modern context, right? That
Yeah.
this is the way they think about it. Ideology will always follow economic reality, sort of thing.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So what have some of the criticisms been of Münster's application of the community of goods? Just bad theology? Is it infeasible? What were the criticisms?
So here, what I've identified really, I think there are three elements that are the center of the criticism. The first of those is its ineffectiveness, right? For the vast majority of the population, in the end, the vast majority of the population faces starvation. So community of goods just didn't work.
Right.
Secondly, the hypocrisy, right? Anne of Leiden and the royal court are exempt. They're living high on the hog. Everybody else is starving. Great lines in some of the chronicles, right? They seize all the open spaces of land. The people plant vegetables, work very hard, and then when harvest time comes, Jan and his buddies swoop in and grab all the food, sort of thing. Then you get explicit statements like this. And the final one is really, and this is the one I find really interesting, is the compulsory nature, right? It's not the community of goods as a problem, it's that it's been imposed on the people. And I think that this comes back to that question. I think that modern historians are looking at this through a very different lens. So I think particularly this notion of the compulsory nature is really intriguing. So what I've been doing recently is trying to look for some other sources and see how they deal with that. And there are a series of articles called the Münster articles that appeared I'm pretty sure they were written in January 1534. So, even before Anabaptist control of the city council.
Right.
And they're probably written in the chancery of Franz von Waldeck, the Prince Bishop of Münster. And they survive in a whole series. They're anonymous, but they're pretty sure it was official in the chancery who wrote them. They survive in a whole series of handwritten and published versions. Unfortunately, trying to decide when the various versions were written, particularly in the published ones we can sort of usually date.
Yeah.
The handwritten ones we're not really sure about, but they provide some interesting insight into how these accusations are made, particularly the compulsory. Obviously, if they're January 1534, they're not going to talk about the failure of community of goods or
Right.
the democracy. But
Yeah.
in terms of the compulsion, I find really interesting the development. If we look at the handwritten ones, pretty well consistently, what we've got are just statements that the Anabaptists sort of took a reckoning of what their possessions were, and anything that was left over that wasn't needed was passed on to other Anabaptists, although this is coming from a Catholic source.
Mhm.
So passed on to others of their sect. And that language, I think, is important, as you'll see in a second. So that's what shows up in the written ones. The most elaborate I've found are by elaborate printed versions are by the prominent Catholic polemicist Johannes Cochlaeus.
Okay.
In March, Cochlaeus publishes a High German version of these articles, and in May he publishes a Latin version. They're pretty well basically the same. But in them, he elaborates extensively on each of the articles. And the one on community of goods really emphasizes compulsion. What he says is, he actually emphasizes all three of these sort of criticisms. He says that, first of all, it's compulsory, and that's fundamentally problematic. And then he says, it's a false attempt to revive Acts 2 and 4, the leadership. And he says, interestingly, in this context, of course, coming from a Catholic perspective, he says that the Anabaptists, like the Lutherans, are trying to implement Acts 2 and 4 inappropriately. And so, we're going to see that the leadership is going to pervert the whole thing. So all of these things appear. But then at the end, he says, instead, if you want to follow community of goods, if you want to institute community of goods, you do it in a voluntary fashion by entering a monastery. This is where the real thing is done.
Okay.
And so what I suspect is going on here is that Cochlaeus, as a well-educated Catholic theologian, is basically reaching back to sort of literature on identifying heretics, medieval literature on identifying heretics, which often talks about how they in essence, it's sort of monasticism gone bad, right? They form these sects and they do all these things that monks do properly, but they do improperly. And one of the things that really sort of drives that home for me is a parallel article on polygamy, where the earliest of these articles just say that among the Anabaptists, after they're rebaptized, if their spouse is not baptized, then they can leave their spouse and remarry. And this shows up consistently in all these. When you get to Cochlaeus, it's just this disappears into this vast catalog of sexual perversion.
Yeah.
Again, something that always comes up with medieval heretics. So I think we've got sort of a crucial point here, right? So the reason that amongst their contemporaries, the Anabaptists are criticized for community of goods in and of itself is that this is a society that still holds Acts 2 and 4 as a very important model for how people live, especially in a Catholic context. And so, but then with modern historians, right, we've sort of lost that image.
Yeah.
Society has, and so then it's it's communist, it's bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I was just as you were talking, I was thinking about the connection with the sort of more mystical Anabaptist traditions, like the ones led by Hans Dank. And the contemporary Hutterite movement would have a greater affinity there, and they still practice a form of community of goods.
Yeah.
Is there can you draw a line between community of goods in Münster and the Hutterite experience?
There's nothing I'm aware of, and as I remember, Stayer doesn't really go into it. I think the where the line might be, and this sort of lines up with what we've just been talking about, is when sort of authorities in Moravia go after the Hutterites. It's, yeah, well, look, they're doing, what the Munsterites did, and look how crazy they were. So
Right.
again,
Okay.
it's sort of something to beat the Anabaptists with, rather than
Yeah.
between
Yeah.
them.
Whether or not there was a line, the
Yeah,
Moravian authorities saw one, which makes
yeah,
sense. Okay. Um, yeah, no, I was in the reading it said that I'm just looking at my notes here. The community of goods was established at the same time as forced baptisms and burning of books. So it's sort of this, like you were talking about with the contemporary historians. I think within the contemporary church there is sort of this, eagerness to see community of goods as this practical thing,
yeah,
without wanting to, bring the baggage of semi-recent political movements into it. But that compulsory nature that you were talking about kind of takes some of that sheen off in that sense that you can only have community of goods if the money is taken or willingly given, which takes more
yeah.
education. So the compulsoriness really kind of takes away that sense of idealism behind it.
Yeah, and I think there's also the issue, right? If it's compulsory, then you're dealing with a population that's not really regenerate yet, right?
Hmm.
They haven't taken the step. They haven't accepted baptism. They haven't accepted the apostolic model truly. If you
Right.
need them to do it.
Yeah. So that's the end of my questions. Did you have any other comments you wanted to add on?
Um, Not a whole lot. As I said, this last part particularly. This idea that what we've got is the creation, like reaching back to medieval sort of heresy, um, characterizations of heretics and stuff, and just sort of dredging these things up. This goes on over and over again in the later Middle Ages, right?
Right.
So that there've been all sorts of studies that suggest that things like the heresy of the free spirit were nothing like the way we find them described in the writings of their opponents, because the writings of their opponents are going back, right back to the early church to find
Yeah.
whoever was sort of identified as a heretic, and they just
Hmm.
build this huge catalog of vices of various kinds, and
Yeah.
in this
Okay.
case, compulsory
Hmm.
community.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So that's our time here. So thanks for joining us on the podcast, Geoff.
My pleasure. And as I said, this is what I'm working on now, so it's a good chance to bounce ideas off somebody else. And
So that's the end of our conversation. One thing that Geoff said that I really appreciated was that, especially in the early criticisms of the community of goods in Munster, especially from the Catholic voices, the criticism was rooted in a reverence of the biblical portrayal of community of goods. After all, Catholic monks and nuns believe that they are living out those teachings in their cloistered communities. I hope that you found something in our discussion worth contemplating as well. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you next time.